Hmm. I'm just waiting for this to come online so I can see. Boom. All right. Good morning. If you're watching this live, please say hi. Let me see you. And uh, if you're watching the replay on Facebook, um, leave a comment saying just hashtag replay, letting me see that people are watching this. If you're watching this on YouTube, good morning, Marcel. Um, if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to give comments as usual. I interact with the comments. It sometimes takes me a little while to get to them, a day or two, um, but I read everything. So, right. So for today, for mimetic literacy, um, actually, I'm going to give a little context for me in this moment. Um, I've been feeling a lot of energy and movement over the last several days, working on a lot of my own projects and my own, you could say my own meditations, I guess, and journaling processes and so on. But I woke up, well, I mean, yesterday I actually came to a state of um, being in touch with a sorrow that I don't understand very well. And that's still with me right now. So I had something else in mind originally today. I was going to talk about the mimetic origins of woo allergy, um, but I have to be pretty on and clear in order to do that without defensiveness. Um, so for today, what I want to explore, highlight, is the thing that goes on with the school system, because I'm going to be focusing particularly on um, the American school system, but I see the same thing appearing in basically every westernized country, including Asian countries. So um, normally I give a little context for these talks, for these videos, because I want these to be episodic. So let me give a very brief intro of that, and then we'll go into the thing with schools and why that's a thing to talk about here. So the point of this whole series is to encourage a sense of lucidity about why we each individually and why we collectively think the things we do and intuit the things that we do. Bringing in a kind of clarity so that instead of the thoughts riding us, we can observe that thoughts ride us and that they ride between us, that they move between us, that they have a context. And by orienting to that context, we can potentially do something different. We can do something more graceful, more kind. But even if nothing big changes, it's, I think, beautiful and fascinating to recognize the context of where our intuitions and impressions and our ideas come from. These are things like love conquers all, love is the strongest force in the world. Where does that come from? Could say because it's true, but like, okay, that's great. There are lots of true things we don't know and lots of things that are popular that aren't true. So um, it being true is not a sufficient reason for it to be popular. So the question is not, is it true? The question is, where does it come from? When you trace where it comes from, you can start to understand how thoughts and beliefs move, how culture is shaped, how minds are shaped. And today we're going to go into, oh, this is how we literally shape minds. I mean, literally, like they're not the physical 3D things, but what's the process by which we educate our children? And why does that education take a very particular pattern? So I'll get into that in a moment. But like love conquers all, love is the strongest force is just one example. Another is never again, down with the Nazis. You might think you know where that's from. Quite clearly, that's from World War II, right? Not really. Not really. It had its clearest manifestation, its gelling from World War II. That's why we recognize the swastika as a symbol of evil. But prior to World War II, the swastika was not a symbol of evil, it was actually a symbol of protection. It's a religious symbol that you can't use anymore for its original purpose because the Nazis appropriated it and now it's associated with Nazism. So noticing these threads gives context. And I particularly feel a sense of like I enjoy talking about this stuff. I enjoy sharing it. I enjoy pointing it out. There's also an issue with collective lucidity about the fact that our collective memory is terrible. It's utterly horrible. And it looks to me like it's getting worse. The history is much shorter. And most people at this point don't even remember the huge, devastating fires that occurred in Australia right before the pandemic started, because those were January 2020. Some people were saying, "Wow, that this is going to be like the defining big catastrophic event of the year," and then COVID hit. And COVID was so sensational, so intense that it just blew out the memory of those fires being the same year. How many people are still talking about the trucker convoy in Canada and Trudeau's use of the Emergency Act to deal with it and the economic implications of that? If it comes up, it's not coming up in a sense of a deep conversation. We've moved on because Putin's war against the Ukraine became so much more interesting. And now collectively, that seems to be not as interesting, even though it's still ongoing. It's a very, very, very short memory. So part of what I'm trying to do here is encourage for those who are interested in these little bits and pieces, just a little bit of recognition, not of facts, not of, okay, got to remember this stuff. That's actually antithetical to the whole of how I am and what I do. But it is instead a matter of recognizing that there's a way of seeing things for yourself clearly that leave your mind more free. It makes it more obvious why things are the way they are. It makes them so much more interesting because you can see the patterns that underlie the structure of society and the movement of passions. And hopefully, like in a super weirdly idealistic kind of way, it would be really cool if this blossomed into actual memetic literacy, the same way that we have something like internet literacy as a requirement for engaging in the modern world. You have to know how to navigate the internet, how to search things on Google, how to use a word processor, and how to send an email. It's just necessary at this point to function in the modern world, or really the postmodern world. I would love for that kind of level of familiarity to be present for memetic literacy. It's very telling that most people have no idea what that even is. So that's the idea of the series, giving these little snapshots. And they're meant to be episodic. So if you haven't seen the previous ones, that's okay. So for today, children and education. So my PhD is in mathematics education. I dove into this area pretty deep. I remember when I think I was 12, and I definitely showed a knack for mathematics, but I hated the subject. It was this grueling thing that I would grind myself through. Like many people, it's like, this is stupid. I'm supposed to solve these problems about finding the area of the triangle given these parameters, and something about quadratics, and have to complete the square and blah, 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 and Pythagorean theorem and yada, yada. It's just, this is stupid. What's this for? I don't care, but I have to. That have to is actually really telling. I hope in the course of today's episode, I'll get into that. That might be too deep to really dig in. This is stuff that I teach in my main program in Mage, really diving into the nuances of these energetics and learning to recognize how they live in our bodies and our minds. But anyway, so up until I was 12, I hated math. And I remember there was a kind of clicking point that happened, a particular spot that started to really get me. Like, I started to notice there were elements that I could enjoy, but I wasn't quite sure what they were. It wasn't solving the problems, it was something else. And then at one point, I learned what's technically called summation notation. It's that big thing that looks sort of like an E It's very famous for being mathy. Like you see this with advanced math stuff. When I got to look at that and I went, oh, I'm about to learn what this is. This is like esoteric symbology or something. When I found out what it means, how it works, I was relieved and I was pissed. Because at that moment, something clarified for me. So that big E notation is actually not very complicated at all. If you're not used to thinking in terms of anything like programming or mathematics, it might be a little intimidating. But it's a fancy way of representing a really long string of things being added together. If there's some sort of systematic thing about how each of the terms are represented, I won't try to define it, but the point is that it's actually not very complicated. You could write it completely differently, and often people do. They don't bother with the summation notation when they apply. Once I saw what it was, for one thing, I felt very smart. Because here it was, I understood this advanced mathematics. It was even in a textbook called Advanced Mathematics, right? Which was a funny way of describing pre-calculus. No, I have since then taught pre-calculus in colleges. But there was, so I had this sense of pride and satisfaction and like, I get to be this smart because I know this thing. I know it's advanced math. I can use this symbol and I know how to use it. And yeah, that's prideful. But the reason I was pissed was because it showed me a place where mathematics had been intimidating me with people. And what I would say now, I didn't have this fully articulated. It was an emotional explosion. If I had articulated it this way, I might have noticed the irony, which is that mathematics had been cloaked in a lot of people being smart at me. People showing all of this stupid stuff about how to do these computations, rather than naming what was actually the beautiful core. To this day, I still maintain most people have never been taught mathematics. What people are taught is computation. Occasionally, you'll see people being taught actual mathematics. It's worth knowing that the word mathematics has something in common with the English word polymath. The math part, like polymath doesn't mean you do or know a lot of numbers and geometry stuff. Polymath means that you know a lot of subjects and you're well versed in a wide variety of things. Math or mathema, I may be butchering the Greek, but mathema is knowledge. That somebody who practices the art of knowing. See, Tin mentioning, I studied mathematics and I strongly agree that people are taught computation. Yeah. So a practitioner of the art of knowing, like it's worth being aware that at the time that these terms are being coined, like the time of Plato's Academy, and even farther back than that, working with the cult of Pythagoras, mathematics was it was a spiritual discipline. This was a way of coming into communion with the divine. All of Plato's allegory of the cave was, and related ideas, Platonic ideals and ideal forms, where we get our use of the word ideal, where like something is perfect, it is ideal. This is coming from like what does that have to do with ideas? Well, the reason idea and ideal have the overlap they do is because of Plato. And I mean, I think idea is Greek. Yeah, I'm pretty sure idea is Greek, the word idea. So Plato was trying to highlight this way in which mathematics is coming into deep relationship with your knowing, with your mathema. So somebody who, it's worth knowing that the Greek word for truth, or one of the Greek words for truth, is aletheia, which is aletheia, where aletheia is in reference to the river Lethe. The river Lethe is one of the rivers that goes through Hades, through the underworld, that when you die, you drink of the river Lethe, you forget your life. Um, I've seen people exchange about stuff with integrals. Cool. And hello, William. So, um, so a practitioner, so aletheia is, so Lave, the river Lave was about forgetting. And so aletheia is unforgetting or a remembering. So aletheia as truth is remembering something in some sense that your soul knows. This is a lot of Plato's idea of why it is that when you look at a mathematical proof, you can recognize that it is true. The reason you recognize it, recognize, which is Latin rather than Greek, but the reason you can see that it's true is because your soul remembers and it recognizes the truth. It unforgets. It aletheias, to butcher the cross languages there. So a practitioner of the art of knowing, somebody who is coming into connection with their divine source through the languages they were using for this were number and shape, but the point of that was not about numbers or shape, it was about the knowing. A practitioner of the art of knowing would have been called a mathematikos. That's where our word mathematics comes from. It's a deeply spiritual discipline. And it's hard to go back farther than ancient Greece to trace exactly where the mimetic threads are, but it looks like this probably came through some of the spiritual practices of Egypt, some of the shamanic-like practices around there. And so in Marcel's coming in, letting me know the etymology of idea, that it came through Latin, but its origin was ancient Greek. Yep. Yep, cool, thank you. I'm just looking at the like the shape of idea, just it feels Greek. Like I bet that's Greek. But then you look at things like ideological, like so anyway, etymology aside. So there's an old thread that, as far as I can tell, it goes as far back as jnana yoga. And there's a whole thing with the etymology of jnana becoming gnosis, which is where we get our word knowing from, why there's a K in the front. It looks like this was from a Proto-Indo-European fragment that sort of passed through many generations of languages. So anyway, language lecture aside, the point is that mathematics actually has this immensely rich spiritual tradition. And interestingly enough, it actually transferred even to the modern day as when you translate mathema into Latin, it becomes scientia, which is where we get science from. So etymologically, science is the heir of this art. And I think in terms of principles, in terms of spirituality, it has a lot in common. So I highlight this to point out there's actually something very deep, very spiritually deep about the relationship to mathematics. It's not about numbers and shape. It's about something tremendously deeper. And the stuff with numbers and shape is something like an application. You're learning how to sharpen your mind. And it became very obvious to me that something like that had to be true, because I was recognizing when I was seeing, oh, I've been intimidated by these symbols and told, oh, you're not ready for this yet. And that's for the advanced students. Okay, now you're an advanced student. There was something infuriating about the fact that they had hidden that much beauty from me. And when I was looking around at all of these people who were hating mathematics like I had just been, and I recognized, no, actually, I have a love for math. I just do not care for mindless computation and being condescended to. And feeling like maybe I'm kind of stupid, or maybe if I struggle, then there's something wrong with me. That's the stuff I didn't like. And so I'm looking around at all these other people, some of whom were having math phobia. This is not okay. So I overcompensated and got a PhD in math education because I was determined to fix how math is taught. There's a whole story to go down that, but it's not exactly at the center of what to say here. But the uh, sort of the punchline is I realized after getting my PhD, or towards the end, like about a year before I finished my dissertation defense, that the field doesn't matter and it can't fix how math is taught. So I saw the system. I applied Mathema to how to fix how math is taught and realized this path cannot work. So this session is not really about mathematics, but I'm using it to highlight an element of some of my context in orienting to this. So there's an element here that's hidden, which is something like, why is the thing that's called mathematics, why do we teach computation? Why is it that most math teachers don't know anything about this context? Or if they do, they go, yeah, like they thought it was something spiritual, but it's just math. It's beautiful, it's fascinating, but it's not like it's anything spiritual. Never mind the fact that mathematicians very, very commonly will refer to the revelation of an insight. That like when they've been working really hard on something and like they've been struggling for weeks or months or years on a problem, and then in a flash of inspiration, they get it. And they see, oh, this is how it works. They often describe an experience of euphoria in the midst of that insight. And a deep knowing, oh, no, this is how it works. And then the rest is cleaning up details. And occasionally they're wrong about some nuance, they missed something. But most of the time, it's an immense flash of clarity of, oh, no, this is how it works. I get it. But that's not spiritual. That's not why, because it's, well, we won't ask that question. Yeah, it's part of the scar in the Western soul. Then we could highlight things with the meaning crisis, but actually, in this case, I don't think that's the center of what's going on. The center of what's going on, the reason I wanted to bring up any of this is because if you actually clearly see some of the mechanisms of why brilliant, fascinating subjects and areas are taught in immensely boring ways, particularly to children, if you actually see why, the process of coming to see why can clarify your vision about a lot of how the world works. So sort of taking this lens and going, here's a little piece of memetics, here's something to see clearly. So I'm going to do a little bit of a detour here and give a couple of examples to highlight the kind of mechanism that I'm talking about. This might already be reasonably familiar for some of you. So like little bits and pieces of memetic literacy have started to percolate. They're like meta memes. But I think it's worth really seeing clearly. So when you see these clearly, the whole picture sort of snaps into view in a very important way. So, so I want to give a couple of examples of how memes propagate, like what it is that makes a meme propagate and survive, what kinds of pressures it goes under. So one example is with a joke. What is it that causes a joke to exist and to thrive and to go from one person to another? It's actually not important that the joke be funny. You would think that that would be a requirement for a joke to spread, but it's not. For example, one way that joke can spread is by being incredibly offensive. Or being a little bit offensive. It doesn't have to be incredibly offensive, but I'm looking at, well, what makes a joke go viral? Which is a really good analogy. Like it spreads exponentially because the act of encountering it causes people to spread it to more people. That's going viral. It's very literal. It's just through behavior, through software, rather than some particular molecular structure moving from one person to another. I guess as an example, which might get me crucified, but I'm happy terrorists. I don't mean anything bad by it, but just to highlight, there's a sign in downtown Olympia, where I'm, the area where I'm at, and somebody had written Black Lives Matter back when the Black Lives Matter movement was just starting up. They'd spray painted this on a billboard that is otherwise basically unused. But they didn't do the spacing right. And so what they had is Black Lives, and they ran out of space. So they wrote matter sort of between Black and lives off to the side. So you're meant to read it as Black Lives Matter. But if you actually read it top to bottom, what it says is Black Matter Lives. You know, like, all right, that's a different kind of statement. Black Matter Lives. Right? And so I don't expect that joke to go viral. But you could imagine how, particularly if I added an extra spin of something like, look at how stupid BLM proponents are, and ha ha ha, and like I did sort of a poke, and then that would cause some offense, and then people would spread my tweet or whatever, going, oh, this is all, like, look at this jerk, and like this white man is showing his like his inherent racism and his privilege from this, and blah blah blah. I'm like, okay, yeah, like you can imagine that would be an effective way for it to propagate, even though the joke is actually pretty stupid. Oh, look, if you swap those two words, it means a different thing. Whoop-de-doo, right? So the defining characteristic of what causes a joke to thrive, to really to spread well, is that the act of hearing it results in its being shared. That's it. Everything else are details about how that happens. If you can hear it, if you can see it, this is actually an application of the law of evolution. It's just that it's applying evolution to a behavior pattern rather than to a molecular pattern. And there's a little bit of woo allergy that I often hit here, where people say, oh, that's just an analogy, right? You don't really mean that these things are living. Well, I don't know. Do you think bacteria are living? That's just an analogy, right? You don't actually think these tiny little blobs of molecules are really alive, do you? Like what is this magic of really alive or not? The intuition that we use to say this living thing has a life cycle and perpetuates, and has something like intention that we can observe. Like those intuitions that allow us to apply it in one area, apply in another just as well. It just so happens that we're dealing with something that isn't physical, but it does have physical manifestations, such as it causes humans to write down or to say the joke. And those are part of how it instantiates in the physical world. And those instantiations are critical for the pattern to continue from one person to the next. So if you can see this, if you can track it, this sort of gives a hint of, okay, this is how memes survive and spread. It's lawful. It's a very powerful law. A related thing, this is not the one of the other examples I originally intended on giving, but I think it's worth seeing. When people talk about things like outrage porn, like the things that spread through the internet, like the articles that get shared, are the ones that get shared the most are the ones that create the most outrage. So what you end up with, there's a way that you can zoom out and see a cultural effect of this. This is part of where bubbling comes from, and why there's such a strong us versus them culture war fragmentation happening. Because as long as people are leaning on reactivity, then the memes that spread are the ones that the memes that spread best are the ones that best flourish in reactivity. So as long as people are reactive-based memes spread better than non-reactive based ones. So and those tend to be ones that encourage outrage. So you end up with this really weird effect where one of the best ways to spread a caricature of your ideas, but your ideas nonetheless, is to put it in a really inflammatory way that your enemies will hate. because then they can hate on it ferociously while they share it in order to argue against it. But now your ideas are worming their ways into the minds of lots of people. Okay? So a belief spreading doesn't even require that people believe the belief. It just requires that they spread it. So this starts to hint at, I could easily go for hours about the structure of memetics at this level and the way that this creates cultural flow. But right now, I'm just trying to highlight just a couple of principles so you can see, okay, this evolutionary thing actually applies. And if I can, I'm 30 minutes in, I want to see if I can wiggle my way back over to, this is why education does what it does. Okay. So one more example. What was it? Right, swear words. What defines a swear word? Swear words are made of memetic propagation. That is, in fact, their entire existence. Okay. So for the sake of not having YouTube algorithms obliterate, or I guess this is Facebook, but also YouTube algorithms obliterating my video, I'm not going to pound on examples too much here. Although that is itself, like the fact that, and be a little bit careful, is highlighting exactly the force that I'm talking about. So if you suppose that the word fizzle is this immensely offensive word on par with the N word. It's amazing that I can't even name the N word except as the N word. It's just, again, an example. It's an amazing, amazing example. Completely vacuous of content except for its method of propagation. Okay. So the so if fizzle is this horrendous swear word, this is like a really naughty word, what becomes the structure? Well, first off, the act of me saying fizzle, he actually said it. Oh my God. Right? And so there's this reaction. Why? The reason the reaction can occur is because the structure of it being a swear word has to already be living in the listener. It becomes important to censor it. This is not true absolutely everywhere, but the fact is that it's a little bit edgy for a space to allow a swear word as horrible as fizzle. This is kind of ridiculous using this word for this. Have it turn out that it actually is some sort of atrocious racial slur or something in Vietnamese or whatever. I don't know. So the in particular, and this is part of where this starts to wiggle over to something really interesting, so you can see what the memetic propagation mechanism is. In particular, there's a whole lot of, you can't say that around children. What if children hear? That's inappropriate for children. So what exactly is wrong with children hearing swear words? They might repeat them. And then what? Like, what's the problem? They uttered those syllables. You know, what is so terrible about those syllables? I mean, it's inappropriate. It's inappropriate because you're making a big deal of it. If we all just stopped caring, it would vanish. So the problem with kids hearing swear words is that you think there's a problem and you freak out if the kids hear it, and therefore you have to stop the kids from hearing it. And then if the kids hear it and say it, that's also devastating, and that's a problem because you're assuming it's a problem. Can you see what I'm talking about in terms of there's no content? There's nothing. Oh God, the kid said fizzle. And the kid also says ba ba blah 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 blah. I go, well, that's an affront against God. Like, what's the problem? What is the problem? Tim says circular reasoning has entered the chat. Yes. So as a general rule, when you encounter circular reasoning and somebody is gripping to circular reasoning, like sometimes it's just because the person hasn't finished the logic and hasn't noticed that there's a loop in the reason. And William's mentioning, oh God, there are so many of these empty problems. Yeah. So when you see not just their circular reasoning, but the act of trying to point out the circular reasoning creates defensiveness and a sense of no, but this matters. What that tells you is you are dealing with something hidden, specifically a mimetic structure that has what, for lack of better terms, but I think is correct to call a survival mechanism. It wants to propagate and it wants to survive. So it has evolved ways of making sure that it propagates. So here is the life cycle of a swear word. I say fizzle, and the kids freak out, or not the kids, sorry, the adults freak out because kids might hear. Now, if you're a kid, fizzle has no special meaning to you. They're like, okay, the adults are getting really reactive, so this is a powerful word. What is it? Right? And it inspires a kind of creativity. So you know that it's somehow naughty. It's something you're not supposed to know about. And it kind of makes it more interesting. So now the kid, like this is where you get these patterns of the kids whispering, like, and they're like whispering swear words to each other and going, oh, that's so naughty. And then when they get caught, oh God, I've been caught saying a bad word. So it reinforces this sense of anxiety in their bodies with the word. And they know it has something to do with kids. So as they grow up, they learn a couple of things without any reason in the background, which is this word is associated with a sympathetic nervous system burst of energy, what you might as well call a fight or flight response, although that's stronger than what I mean. But like, said the word, right? Fizzle. But it creates this sympathetic nervous system response, and that's part of why I'm using fizzle as like an example of this, because it totally doesn't, and it highlights how absurd it is when you actually see the structure. Okay, so so there's already this sympathetic nervous system response in relationship to hearing or saying the word, and a knowledge it's really important somehow that kids be protected from this. So now, as the kid grows into a teen and especially into an adult, they have to be a little careful about saying fizzle around kids because all of the other adults will freak out. And if they hear someone say fizzle, it creates the same sympathetic nervous system response. And if a kid is around when that appears, there's this, it's bad somehow. And it sort of fries the thinking a little bit. And you get to, I hate these terms, signal virtue. But you can sort of polish your good guy badge a little bit by saying that's inappropriate. There are children here. Right? Which is why adults will converge on somebody who swears around the kid, which now recreates the scenario that has the kids that are around going, what's this naughty word? That's the life cycle of a swear word. The reason there's circular reasoning and the reason it's vacuous is because the entire purpose of the propagation is its own survival. That's it. Now, if you're thoroughly infected with this meme and it has evolved the ability to wiggle its way into your reasoning processes, which it does a little bit. It does a little bit like, no, we have to protect the children's innocence. Their what? What is innocence? Well, you know. So pretend I don't. Just pretend for a moment I don't know what innocence is. Could you describe it to me? See William laughing about polish your good guy badge. I have to admit, I got that that phrase, I believe, from Anton LaVey, who founded the Church of Satan, and the Church of Satan being this it's basically oh, you think swear words are bad. What if we speak in nothing but swear words? And then like really embracing naughtiness. It has basically nothing to do with actual worship of Satan. They sort of mock it, but they're atheists. Um, and so yeah, LeVay pointed out this polish the good guy badge thing. So I'm borrowing it pretty explicitly from him. It's a matter of acknowledging where my mimetic threads come from. So, oh yeah, I lost track of what I was doing here. Oh, that's okay. Right. So, oh, right. Wiggling into your reasoning. So the bit about innocence. This is not to say that there isn't anything that the concept of innocence is pointing at, but its purpose, the purpose of those thoughts is not to track the truth. The purpose of those thoughts is to ensure mimetic propagation. But of course, it doesn't feel like that on the inside. It seems like, well, but we do need to protect the children. But the question of protect them from what? This is far from clear. And very far from clear. And again, if you find circular reasoning, well, we have to protect them from losing their innocence. Okay? Why is their innocence so important? Because they're children. So would it be is it important for adults to preserve this innocence? Oh no, adults aren't innocent anymore. What? So what is it? It's childhood innocence. Oh, okay, great, thank you. So so once again, you have this kind of circular reasoning, and that's one of the signs that you're looking at a structure that is there purely for the propagation of a meme, that is part of the life cycle of a meme. That's not all memes have that kind of structure to them, but when you encounter it, it's a pretty good sign that you're dealing with one of them. So the reason swear words focus so much on children is precisely because if they didn't, they wouldn't propagate as reliably. So the ones that evolved a focus on children propagated better than the ones that didn't. Straight out of evolution. Evolutionary theory applied to mimetic structures. So what you find is not only each individual swear word has this thing of, oh, you can't say that around children, but you'll also find that because there's a kind of synergy between them, the whole overall memeplex, it's not really a complicated memeplex, but the mimetic bundle, the sort of a subspecies of meme that is swear words, has a convergent strategy where they support each other. So you don't say fizzle around children, but you also don't say calickle. Oh man, you never say calickle. Especially not around children, like their poor ears, right? And so the concept of you have like watch your language as a generalized booster for all of them, right? So they end up with kind of this symbiotic effect, or symbiosis is not quite the right term. There's a term for this in evolution where you have several different species that, even though they're not directly attached to each other, they're both affecting the environment they're in a way that is supportive of one another because their goals are aligned. I forget what the term is for that, but this is an instance of this. And frankly, I don't mean this as a metaphor. I mean it as an instantiation of the principle. This is, again, a thing of, like, when you actually see memes clearly, you recognize we are talking about living structures. We are talking about biology. It's just the biology of behavior patterns instead of the biology of molecular patterns. So these are much more than just analogies, to the extent that a cat as a living thing is not just an analogy. Viruses undergoing evolution is not just an analogy. Same thing here. Exactly the same thing here. So you can feel, by the way, I want to call this out explicitly. There's a thread of defensiveness that just arose there, and I want to name it explicitly because I don't actually want that energy to be part of how I show up for these presentations. It's something I'm working through. But when I named at the beginning, I was not really in a place to talk about the woo allergy today. This is part of what I mean. I'm still a little pissed about the way that the woo allergy has been applied to me, and I still carry some victimization, like, oh, that happened to me, like that, and I haven't worked through that myself. So that thread was that piece showing up for me. Just wanting to explicitly name that so that you can catch the impact on yourself, and to clean that aside. Okay, so this pattern. So I want to zoom out and reorient here, highlight. So this pattern of where a meme explicitly targets children in order to propagate itself. It's not always children. Like the N word is not explicitly child focused. It's actually it's actually much more adult focused in a curious way. Like, people will freak out around kids. That's not the focus of the meme. The reason the N word has become so intense is because it both has the child thing, and it has that word is not for you element. And there's been kind of this runaway effect where people have freaked out about it so much that it's, in practice, the N word is, in some legends, you would actually have, you'd have the idea that you could summon a demon by knowing its true name and speaking it. The N word is the true name of a demon. We've created a demon. And it gets summoned by its name, and it has very particular rules, and it makes people go insane just by its name being spoken. It shows up and possesses people. And you can sort of almost hear it sniffing around because I'm referring to it indirectly, the N word. Like, there's this structure that comes in. So not to say that there isn't a history, that there are reasons, blah, 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 but the reason I have to even say any of that is because the demon's there. So I don't care about the details of what justification you can give it. The fact is, the reason it propagates is for mimetic reasons, for mimetic structures. And when you can learn how to see it, you can see what its life cycle is. You can see how it possesses people and how it moves through cultures. But I wanted to give that as a brief example of a case where a meme can target something other than children as part of its propagation method. So it's maybe another example is that's probably easier to see is freshman hazing in Hell Week for colleges, for their fraternities particularly, and I guess the sororities as well. That's another example where they're not targeting children, but the meme does target newcomers. Okay, that's a very important detail there. See William saying, it's as if the joy of discovery, indeed having so many things to easily discover and not being overburdened with dogmatic frameworks yet, was characterized as innocence. Yeah, innocence seems to have some kind of, it has an implicit meaning of something like the mind is virgin. To evoke a little bit of a disgust response, it's worth bearing in mind that the reason memes get so excited about children and give people a sympathetic nervous system response with respect to children is because they have evolved to use children as part of their reproductive cycle. So it is, in a sense, sexual heat because it's a child. Now, it's not sex in the way that human adults do, but to the extent, and also these things tend to propagate by sort of a self-replication. They have more in common with viruses for the most part than they do with sexually reproducing organisms. Although there are exceptions. There are exceptions for sure. But the analogy is quite clear. It's like they need to embed their eggs in the minds of children in order to propagate from one generation to the next. See William also mentioning, don't have a heated memology moment. Yeah, I guess memology is an appropriate word. I notice I never used it that way. I call it memetics. I'm not sure why. Anyway, so this this pattern, the reason you can look at things like the swear word as a really specific example of more general phenomenon, which is that when a mimetic structure, for a mimetic structure to propagate across generations, it has to target the newcomers of the generation. So the mimetic structures that evolve to target the newcomers, which is usually children, outperform and outlast the ones that don't. And uh, bear in mind the example of the jokes. The same thing is happening with the swear words. It's just that that element wasn't emphasized. You can have a really funny joke. It's really compelling. It's amazing. It maybe even creates something like tears of joy and spiritual transformation. And it's just absolutely gorgeous to behold. And it takes like 20 minutes to tell. And it takes a while to look at it and learn it and examine it. And it's a lot of energy. So that joke will not propagate as far as, oh, you made a pun, huh? You're trying to punish us. Right? Because it's so easy to remember and to repeat. So the question for propagation is not how compelling is it, or even how intelligent is it. The question is how much does the reception of the mimetic structure result in its being shared? So an example for the 20-minute transformational joke, if part of the transformation reliably resulted in people going, that was absolutely amazing, and I must learn how to tell this, and that compelled people to study the joke so that they could replicate it, it would have a longer life cycle because it takes longer to say and it takes a while to read, but it would reliably reproduce. But if you encounter it and that was amazing, that's your reactions, that was amazing, I don't think I'm up for learning that. Its mimetic strain dies the same way that genetic strains die. Doesn't matter how important it could be. It doesn't matter how beautiful. It doesn't matter how funny. All that matters is, how reliably does the reception result in its transmission? That's it. That's evolution in a nutshell. Okay? So if you look at, I realize that I spent all this time describing the evolution of memes in general, and I'm not going to emphasize as much about the education structure as I'd originally hoped. But maybe you can start to see a glimmer of this. So let me wrap this back to the stuff with mathematics as an example. This is not particular to mathematics, although I could say the same thing about English. Like there's this book I've been reading through. This is a delightful book of using literary alchemy. It's kind of Unlocking Harry Potter: 5 Keys for the Serious Reader by John Granger, and it goes into the tradition in English literature of literary alchemy. It highlights the ways in which literary alchemy has structured an enormous amount of even things like Shakespeare and Dickens, and like these symbols are just rich all over the place, and they were known in the Elizabethan time. It was such that performers could walk people through an alchemical transformation process via their plays or via the stories that they would tell. And that came into our traditions, and it's also very clear. He makes a very compelling he makes a very compelling case that Rowling wrote the Harry Potter series in this tradition. It's immensely clear when you read through that. And in the course of reading through this, I feel like for the first time in reading through this analysis, I feel like for the first time I'm getting some orientation to what an English class should have been about. Not necessarily specifically about literary alchemy, but it's an amazing entry point for me to go, oh, there's something rich about the soul here, about these traditions of stories. But that's not what we're taught. It's like, the whale is a symbol for God. They just flat. See, Tin mentioning, honestly, I'd say all subjects are taught terribly, but you can't brute force your way through maths tests like you can for history, for example. Yeah. So the common theme here I want to highlight is that there's, so sort of the punchline is that a lot of memes propagate really well if they can stun the mind of the child that they are getting injected into, such that the child can't help but repeat the meme. This is like if you lobotomize somebody, then you stop their ability to learn. And I understand. Just pretend that's true. You remove the right chunk of their brain, and then they can't learn anything new. So if you inject in them a behavior pattern and then you lobotomize them, now they're guaranteed to repeat that behavior pattern like a machine. So if you can do the same thing basically through software, this is a very powerful strategy for memes to propagate. So this is, you'll see if you learn how to look for this, a lot of different memes all converged on children at the same time. And not necessarily the same time in history. I mean, it's the same time sort of socially, the same place socially. When it comes to mandatory child education, the children have to go through years of education, which is like, okay, in abstract, that can make sense because culture is a mimetic structure. It's a mimetic superstructure. It's a memeplex. It becomes very important if you want your culture to propagate in a rich way, and that if the memes don't automatically propagate on their own, you need to make an effort to transmit them. So your conscious involvement becomes part of the transmission process. So this is how we transfer a lot of our scientific knowledge, for instance. We make sure that the scientific knowledge passes on, because the scientific knowledge on its own doesn't make us pass it on. Although it kind of does, because we then want to. So a whole bunch of these converge at the same time, which is why you'll see the way that you mimic what amounts to lobotomization is through trauma. If you can overwhelm a child's system with experiences that they can't handle, such that they go into something like a freeze state, like they go through the fight or flight, the upset, and then you keep inducing in a way that overwhelms them until they go into a shutdown state. This is sort of like letting an infant cry itself out is actually the infant giving up. If you can create that physiological effect in a child, such that their only path to something vaguely resembling relief, or at least less punishment, is following a very particular behavior pattern that you drill and you drill and you drill and you drill into them, then what happens is that behavior pattern becomes a defining characteristic of how they orient. And if you do it just right, that can be the seed that they use to then turn to the next generation and do the same thing. At that level of abstraction, it sounds just horrendous. Why would anybody do this? Well, the reason is because they were traumatized as kids under the same process. Mimetic evolution does not require that you have villains in the background. And this is part of the reason why I'm very suspicious of most conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories are easier for people to think of when they are mimetically illiterate, because it's easier to imagine that there is some sort of cabal or some very powerful person in the background or something who's pulling the strings, than it is to imagine the actual evolutionary structure of memes and to see the mimetic realm clearly. Once you see that, you recognize a lot of things don't need conspiracies to have intelligent effort put behind them. Intelligence doesn't require there be people who are making those plans. It just requires that mimetic evolution converge on something. And most people aren't aware of this. So most of their ideas are, well, then how do you explain this mimetic evolution? Oh yeah, do you think it, like, I'm not great at coming up with examples. So I've just gotten so used to, no, this is because of convergent evolution. There's nothing complicated here. Maybe there are villains. I'm not saying there aren't conspiracies, but most of the time when people go to conspiracies, they have no idea what they're talking about. You don't need an Illuminati to have a conspiracy to traumatize children in school systems. So one of the very concrete examples that's starting to become more aware in our cultural atmosphere is the act of taking a young child and making them sit still all day in a chair. We'll give them a break in the middle, but then we make them sit down, and then we get mad at them and punish them when they can't sit still all day and they start to get uncomfortable and they start to like need to move this energy. We're talking like 5, 6, 7-year-olds. They're not meant to just sit in a chair. Their bodies don't do that. Their bodies are still wild. They're still wild animals at that age. Like they're not just wild animals, but their bodies haven't been colonized yet. Haven't been colonized by these mimetic structures. So making them sit down and then telling them things like, there is something wrong with you if you can't pay attention. Then this transfers something of, like this teaches kids how to feel shame for existing, for having the nature they do. Now, this has already been present before, but it gets a big amplification in education. And the reason is you're in this condition where you're getting blasted with certain perspectives and certain attitudes. Although I would say most of the point of public school is not about the information that's being spoken. The actual purpose is about the social structure that's being imposed, the relationship to authority and the arbitrariness of authority. I see Tin mentioning, are adults even supposed to sit in chairs so long? And William responds, yeah, I'm standing right now. Yeah, and frankly, no, adults aren't meant to do this either. But we've had our embodiment beaten out of us by an education system that has colonized our bodies and minds with these mimetic structures. Which is why it's very easy for adults who are very well-meaning, who in fact care about kids, to impose these same ideas, these same structures on the children, and to see something like, yeah, some of these kids are able to sit still. Why? Kids are different, but also some of them have internalized a lot more. It's important for me to be good in order to be an okay person. Or some have already gotten the skill of disconnecting from their bodies a little bit more than others. And also fear from seeing the rambunctious ones getting punished, getting sent to the principal's office, getting yelled at by the big adult. This is a detail that many people miss. The size difference and the strength difference between adults and children is immensely important for kids. And having your caretakers and protectors directing destructive energy at you when they could kill you, that's incredibly destabilizing. And it's telling that a lot of adults have no idea how to deal with their frustration with children, especially their own children. That they can get into fights with their children. Where do those structures come from? Why anger at the child instead of accounting for this is the actual nature of the child as they are? And I, as the adult, am able to see more. And because of that, I am responsible for holding the context and holding the parts that the kid currently can't track. And yeah, I don't want you to jab scissors into the wall. That's not great. So I understand that's something you want to do. Oh, now you're mad at me because I took the scissors. Yes, okay, I am a horrible monster. I know. And it's not at all fair that you want to jab the wall and I'm holding the scissors that you want to jab it with. Right? So like there's a maturity that we could bring, but many people run into patience problems. Why? Do you notice how it's normalized? Oh yeah, kids, sometimes you just get tired. Yeah, sometimes you get tired. Why isn't that taken as something to transform yourself and recognize, why is it that my getting tired results in me being mad at the kid instead of being physically unable to take the scissors because my body's exhausted? Like, it's not that kind of tired. It's something else. Why anger? Why irritation? Why withdrawal of affection? The reason is because of these mimetic structures. Frankly, whenever you are carrying a trauma, you are actually carrying a piece of the maturity level that you had when you were traumatized. So a lot of people are operating with these chunks of being emotional toddlers and emotional children and emotional teenagers. And this is the basis of how they orient to everything. Because those are better at propagating the memes that do the traumatization. So the reason school is awful, the reason why you, like, there's a piece here that seems like once you really look at it, once you look at it with sober eyes and an open heart, the problem is stunningly obvious. The fact that there's a problem is stunningly obvious, and the nature of it can become clearer the more closely you look. Why is it that children who are immensely curious, they want to explore the world, they enjoy interacting with things and want to figure out how things work and can be very affectionate and can be very exuberant? Why is it that even though they run around and they want to learn about the world, when you send them to the place that is supposed to teach them things, a lot of them think it sucks? That they don't want it, that they find it boring or exhausting, or that some parts are interesting, but this part was bad and I don't like it. And I don't want to go to school today. Well, you have to. Why? Because it's a school day and this is what you do. I don't understand. Well, that's tough. You're going to. As my mom would say, I'm bigger, meaner, and uglier than you. Right? There's this coercive force. Like, why is a coercive force necessary for teaching children who want to learn? Oh, because they're not in control. Not in control of what? Why is control so important? And I know you can come up with answers because this particular memeplex's life cycle has hijacked conscious thinking. So people come up with reasons along the lines of, we need to protect their innocence. Oh, children uh, won't make responsible choices with their lives if we don't guide them. Really? Have you tried? Have you given them a chance? Have you, like, any of them for generations? Where does this idea come from? I didn't really look there, did you? Right? So there's this when you start to look at these structures, you start to see this vacuousness and this circleness. We have to teach children because otherwise they won't learn. William's mentioning also school is not guidance. Yes and no. Like, I hear what you're saying and I agree with your sentiment. And I want to highlight that the whole purpose of school is a kind of guidance, but it's guidance into being mentally and emotionally stunned and stupefied so that they are better hosts for these mimetic structures. So this is why, but I agree with you in terms of they're not actually telling you how to live your life at all. It's like utter garbage. And even if they were, they'd be telling you in terms of, like, now these are the things that you should know. Now we're going to complete this quiz and you need to answer the right questions and give it some real thought and show us that you're giving this real thought. Oh, that wasn't good enough thought, Billy. You know, it's insane, but it's a common form of insanity, so it's normalized. So to the example of math, just to highlight, why do we teach computation but not mathematics? The reason we teach computation, there's several reasons, they converge, but the reasons we teach computation are, computation is actually useful for the egregore. I haven't used the term egregore before in this discussion, but like memeplex, sort of coherent memeplex that has its own sort of living order. The way that I am alive, but also my cells are alive. You could call both of them The analogies would be, there are memes, but then there are also bigger memes made of smaller memes. And the memes that are big enough start to behave like living creatures. So when you look at the scale of civilization or even the nation, there's an egregoric structure that wants, and at this level it totally makes sense to talk about wanting, but it wants people to be capable of doing computations because it is a powerful form of magic. When people can actually do it, and glibly using the term magic without properly defusing people's woo alarm bells or woo allergies, whatever. I'm a little bored with that part, so I'm just going to say there's a way to de-wooify it, and it's clear and powerful enough to say this has power. This has actual magical power. And in terms of competing with other nations, it's very important to be able to do that kind of computation. This is actually part of why math education became such a big push. This was competing particularly with the Soviets in the Cold War. But that doesn't say why computation instead of mathematics. The reason is mathema, the actual art of knowing, would free children of the ability for a lot of these memes to be able to infect their minds anymore. This is not unique to mathema. It's not unique to mathematics, but mathematics very directly targets aletheia. You could do something similar through a really rich kind of exposure to English. Like you think of people like George Orwell. What would happen if kids really understood 1984? Not just, oh, you could have a sort of big brother takeover from fascism, but actually grok, actually deeply understand and take in. You can have mind wiping, mind washing structures in culture, and culture can be made of those. And we have examples. How can I think clearly? Right. So these are very powerful. They're still memes. They're still mimetic structures, but they're lucid mimetic structures. They propagate by offering real value and encouraging clarity in order to show that they have more value than the stupefying memes. So as part of a mimetic defense system, a lot of these memes have created a convergent evolutionary immune system to methods that create too much clarity. You can't afford to teach mathema. That is too dangerous to successful mimetic propagation across generations. And again, you don't need a conspiratorial Illuminati for this. This is just how mimetic evolution works. I could describe the details of exactly how the mechanisms work. This is sort of like zooming in on exactly what are the details of the mechanics by which proteins read DNA in order to build more proteins. I could go into that, but it's not a level of detail that's necessary for this. You can sort of zoom out and see the evolutionary force. So how do you teach computation and not mathema in a way that ensures propagation? Well, the whole thing about hating math is actually part of it. It's actually a feature, not a bug. Making it so that you have to solve problems that you don't care about using methods you don't care about, except that the teacher is applying it via a kind of implicit social threat that you'll get bad grades and you won't graduate and you'll have to do more of this if you don't do well now. But also you don't care about it. Like it's not that hard to explore ways that mathema or even computation, but certainly mathema, it's easier with mathema, how that applies to the world, and to zoom in on what are some things that you care about. Oh, okay, in this situation, you're concerned about this thing about whether your friends are going to like you if you do X, Y, Z. Hey, there's a domain of mathematics called game theory that actually explores this. We can play with this and see some hints about it. Would that be interesting to you? Right. So this, like, making this relevant based on what is actually inspiring. It's not that hard. It just requires that you not have in mind ahead of time, this is the curriculum we're going to do. It requires dynamic clarity and a willingness to let the child's creativity lead. And these are skills that have usually been burned out of most teachers, and that the structure around them makes hard to do because it's more effective for the mimetic propagation if these alternative methods are not available. So math becomes pointless and boring and mind-numbing as part of its method of transmission that allows it to stay safe to static mimetic propagation. 10 mentioning also doesn't help that teaching actual understanding is way harder and trickier to grade. And William jumps in with what I was about to say here. Even thinking in terms of grades, though, is part of the school memeplex. Exactly. This business of your value, like I'm going to grade you. What is grading? Like I'm going to tell you how good or bad you did. Say 10 mentioning indeed. Yeah. How good or bad you did. Right? Now, in terms of feedback, if the intention was feedback, that makes sense. But it's not like the kids are trying to accomplish something and the teacher is saying, hey, look, you might not know. Like there's a thing that you're trying to do. Like here you are trying to think about game theory. I'm trying to sort out things with wanting to set up some kind of football team or something like that. You're a little confused about how to motivate people to show up. Okay, so you think about XYZ, dot, 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 dot. Okay, great. Now, I can see something you don't. Would you like me to point it out to you? And then the kid can highlight, yeah, okay, so what do you see? All right, so rather than telling you, and this is part of the art of teaching, like a real art of teaching, a really good teacher will zoom in on this kind of thing. Instead of just saying, this is the thing that you're missing, although not to say that that's always off, but like more often than not, an invitation to see is much more powerful than an instruction about this is what is true, when that's possible. So the teacher, if they're really sharp, could say, how would you deal with it if Anna over here notices that she could get a better deal by switching teams? And then just leave the kid to think through that stuff and go, okay, and I missed, okay, yeah, there's something here I don't know or I don't understand. There's no reason to grade because the kid is learning how to solve a problem that they care about and the teacher is offering feedback. So what's the grading for? To tell whether they pass for what? Are you trying to teach kids skills, or are you trying to sort kids into some sort of industrial system where you know what gear shape each kid is so you can plug them into the machine? Not to say that the gears thing was always useless, but it's worth tracking. That's the system we're looking at. Okay. So yeah, I see that 10, like I said, indeed, and it's like, yep, this is a thing. But anytime you're evaluating a person or you're putting a person's work in a good bad scale, it's worth tracking why. The actual purpose of grading is to induce the connection to external reward and punishment as the method for establishing safety in your social relationships. Because then the overall memeplex can control you better. The purpose of school is to destroy your creativity and make you more pliable for culture, to install more memes. It's installing a mimetic operating system. Everything else is secondary. Once you see this really clearly, this is not a matter of, oh, this is awful, this is terrible. I mean, I do think it is awful and terrible, but it's also worth tracking, why did this happen? How is it propagated? It's not propagated because teachers are evil or they don't care about the kids. It's not because the principals are numb to the effects on children. They're all trying to do their best. It's not because parents don't care. Everybody in the system can absolutely love the children and absolutely want the best for them. And you can still end up with a system that is designed to scar children's minds so that they retain a certain level of immaturity so that they are more controllable by what amount to demons. If you don't see these structures clearly, you can't even begin to propose an alternative that could possibly work. Which is why, one of the reasons why I keep making these nudges towards mimetic literacy, really seeing these things clearly, practicing seeing them clearly, noticing our own means, the mimetic structures that move through us. Noticing, for instance, earlier when I was getting a little defensive, when I was getting a little victimized by this bit about the woo allergy. Where's that from? I don't have to know my whole psychological history, but knowing the mimetic history, that's helpful. Okay, so I am. Let me add a little bit of a button at the end here because there's something that I could end here and just go, yep, it all sucks, which is why this stuff is important. Let me add a little bit at the end here. I hinted at this earlier in terms of there being a different strategy for mimetic propagation. All this is based on highlighting one species of meme. Okay. And this is a species that I sometimes called stupefying. This is the same thing as what David Deutsch refers to as anti-rational memes. And I think it's reasonable to think of them as a species. Like they in fact can't breed with the other one. It's like it's a species. It is a mimetic species that well they can kind of breed, sort of ish. Anyway, we can define the biological tree of memes at some other point. That my job is not taxonomy. My job is, hey, there's a real discipline here. There's something real to look at. But this, like I've been focusing specifically on one species, which is the one that ensures its propagation by stunning the mind of its potential host and scarring that person in exactly the way needed so that they cannot help but stun and scar other minds the same way. This is one method of ensuring mimetic propagation across generations. But there is this other way, what I tend to think of as clarifying memes, where what they focus on is being close to reality, thereby offering real value and encouraging their potential hosts to see this truth and see the truth in general, to get clear orientation so that they can see that these clarifying memes are actually offering real value to the host. It's more symbiotic. An example of this is Maxwell's equations. A lot of science is like this, particularly physics. Pretty well chemistry, parts of biology, large parts of biology. The more distant you get from physics, the more socially weird it gets. Psychology is not like this. This is not how memes propagate in psychology at all. Definitely not in sociology. Sociology is almost pure mimetic battlefield. But anyway, the point of something like Maxwell's equations is that it is describing something. It's not that the equations themselves are the thing to know. It's that the equations give you insight into a certain aspect of reality. It sort of helps your mind to shape in a way that allows you to make correct predictions and anticipations about how to interact with the world, such that you become less surprised. like you can interact with electricity and magnets and light and all these different forms of radiation and so on, and they fit in a certain way such that you can start to learn how to interact with reality directly. And you can see that that happens. So then the reason that you would want to transmit Maxwell's equations, and really the whole thinking structure behind that vision of electromagnetism and related classical physics, is because you well, it's like the meme wants to propagate, but the reason the meme wants to propagate is because, well, it's because it survives if it does this. All memes want to propagate because they survive. It's just how it works. But the way it goes through is by offering value. And so your desire to encourage value for others is the thing that this rides. And the way in which you transmit it is by encouraging others to see reality clearly so that they are able to see that, oh yes, this bit with Maxwell's equations is showing something powerful and true. So there's a whole host of things like that. Talking about mimetic literacy is a very self-referential meta example. The things I'm trying to say here are not things I want to pound into people's minds and make them believe no matter what. It's a matter of when you look around and you see these structures, like I'm inviting you to look where I'm pointing. When you look there, you'll see whatever you see. I am confident enough that I am hugging the truth that you will see something that is absolutely compatible with what I am saying, that you will come to a deeper realization of what I am saying by the act of looking. You will find yourself transformed in the process, maybe not dramatically at first, but it can be quite dramatic. And in the course of doing that, you will see, oh, there is immense value in my coming to see these things clearly. And maybe you end up talking about it with others such that you invite them into the same kind of clarity. This is not like a proselytizing thing. I'm not asking you to do this. This is more like, if it happens, it happens, which is part of the nature of what a lot of clarifying memes do. They're not trying to press on you with some kind of social pressure. They're saying, hey, when you're ready for it, here is some clarity for you. I'll do what I can to make it easy for you to see the true fact that I am offering you real value. The deal is we help each other. That's what I get out of it. I, the meme of truth, get propagated. And you get benefit by the act of having me living inside you, being a part of you, part of the structure that you are using to interact with the world. So it is possible, like these two mimetic species, the clarifying memes and the stupefying memes, they tend to go to war, because the stupefying memes work better in situations where people are not changing very much, where people are following tradition and following rigid structures. And clarifying memes work better in conditions where people are willing to discard absolutely anything they believe, are not attached to any particular perspective, and are devoted to truth. So the conditions of their tremendous flourishing, their respective flourishing, is actually counterproductive to the other, which is why they fight. But the nature of the fighting is very different, very different. Most of what you'll see with the culture wars are different stupefying memes attacking each other for dominion, but they can all agree you shouldn't have clarity. And occasionally you'll find these threads of clarity running through, which have real power because they're grounded in reality. Same reason why science won out against religion when the two went to loggerheaads. Religion was dying out for complicated reasons, but science is grounded in the truth of the physical world and could demonstrate its power. You can persecute people all you want, but after a certain point when you can literally throw lightning at will, thinking of like Tesla, there's real power. That's real power. So same thing going on here. The stupefying memes would like to destroy clarifying ones, but the clarifying ones in an important way, they can be destroyed, but it's a lot harder. And over time, it looks likely that they will probably win out more and more over time. Probably. But in the meantime, what do you do about education? I don't know, but I do know that I have no intention of sending my children to school. I was homeschooled, so I've seen this work. But also, part of that is in prioritizing the sovereignty of my children. So if my kids really want to go to school, I'll let them know, hey, just so you know, I'm aware of some things that you may not be aware of, but I'm here for you. And we'll get through this. And when they come back each day, we'll sync up and go, hi, let's do a little bit of weeding. Let's help you move the emotions that have gotten stuck in you from what they've been doing and check in with you. Is this what you still want to do? It's fine if you do. I'm absolutely in support. So there are moves that we can do in the interim. But I have no idea just yet what a clear civilization would end up being. I see William mentions, where I lived before, there was a store called Clarity Cannabis. You pointed in the direction of a reusable shopping bag from there. Oh, you mean in your room? Like, that's cool. Okay, so I'm an hour and a half into my hour-long talk, so I will end this here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your interactions. I find it enlivening to interact with people, so I'm really grateful for when people hop on and chat. It lets me respond a little bit to where people are coming from. I can certainly stand up here and give lectures, and I can go on pre-recorded things if I wanted to. But the reason I show up live is because I really like getting to interact with people. Yeah, so thanks for being here. And yeah, I will see you all next week.